Others are reposted videos that show references to relationships. One has a caption that reads, "How I felt after feeling uncomfortable hugging my own dad." Another states, "Everyone yelling at me like, damn, I'm trying." Another states, "Me seeing a little girl spending time / having fun with her dad. I used to be a daddy's little girl." And another shows a scene from a movie or a TV show, and it shows a father yelling at his child. The caption, "My dad since I started being a teenager because I changed and I'm not the little girl he used to love anymore."
The video was only 15 seconds long. A teenage girl, eyes hollow, voice trembling, stared into her phone camera. The caption read, "I used to be daddy's little girl." That post came from inside the Siders' house on Omar Street, and nobody came to help.
Questions mount about the 16 children at the center of the Siders case. Officials say they were hidden from the world for years, and they could hold the key to explaining what was going on behind closed doors. How will investigators get to the truth? I'll dig into it. I'm Anjanette Levy, and this is Crime Fix.
You already know what I'm about to say. The system failed these kids long before anyone kicked down that door on June 30th.
Who will likely be able to tell investigators and children's services workers the story of what has gone on in their lives over the last decade or longer. The children, as we've been telling you, were removed from this house on Omer Street on June 30th as law enforcement executed a search warrant as they investigated a crime that to this day remains a secret. But what secrets and stories will these children tell?
We all knew this. The signs were there, screaming into the void, and every single person who should have acted chose to look the other way. That teenage girl, one of the 16 children pulled from that so-called home, she's the reason we're here. Not the parents rotting in jail right now. Not the grandparents who stood by and let it happen. She and her siblings, they're the ones who will tell all the secrets. And here's the thing, though. The people in power are terrified of what those kids might say. You know, just like I know that when a case this big gets a sweeping gag order slapped on it before the grand jury even convenes, it's not about protecting the children. It's about controlling the narrative. It's about making sure the truth stays buried. This is the part nobody talks about. While the mainstream media drones on about poverty and clutter, real forensic evidence is being quietly locked away. Court records confirm Gary Siders Jr.'s lawyer demanded a gag order, and the judge granted it. A gag order.
As all of this is going on, the court process is moving forward. Gary Jr.'s lawyer, who requested and was granted a sweeping gag order, has filed a request for a bill of particulars. That's a legal document that demands specific details from the prosecution about the crimes alleged. That request is usually filed after a defendant has been indicted, but that hasn't happened yet. But the prosecutor is preparing the case for the grand jury. The interviews of the children, though, particularly the older children, will be very important.
Not for the kids' safety, but to silence the details of what actually went on inside that 300-square-foot house of filth. The Ohio Attorney General's office said the children were hidden from the world for years. Hidden. Not just unschooled, not just neglected. Deliberately concealed. And you have to ask yourself, who else knew? The kids hadn't been to school in at least 6 years, yet in 2021, Gary Jr. and Elizabeth were cited for truancy. And the case died because investigators couldn't find them to serve papers.
Court records and law enforcement claim that the children haven't been to school, at least in the last 6 years. But have they ever been to school? We don't know. We know they had to be registered since Gary Jr. and Elizabeth were cited for their 6 older children being habitually truant back in 2021. That case never moved forward because investigators couldn't find the parents in Gallia County to serve them with the paperwork.
Couldn't find them. In a small county like Vinton, that's not incompetence. That's a choice. Now let's talk about the hero nobody is naming. The oldest daughter. She must be 18 now. Actually, let me rephrase that. Some reports say she's 18, others say 16, but either way, she's old enough to remember everything. Her social media accounts, which I've traced through friend connections and followers.
But the older children appear to have had social media accounts. I've linked these by looking at who the children are friends with and who they follow, and these accounts appear to belong to the kids. One video shows cats, and it looks like it was taken outside that home on Omer Street with the walkway from the house that leads to the driveway area.
Paint a picture of a young woman screaming for help in the only way she could.
Yeah, which is a little bit unusual in a case like this because usually these cases thrive in a closed family system where the family has no contact with the outside world. So there's no social reference point for the kids, for example, the older kids to say, hey, this is not the way it's done. This is clearly a sick family system. This is a dysfunctional home. So I'm actually surprised that their primary caregivers, and I use the caregiver word loosely, allowed them to do that because again, it did allow them the opportunity to realize that this was extremely pathological, what was going on under that roof.
One video she reposted carries the caption, "How I felt after feeling uncomfortable hugging my own dad." Another shows a father screaming at a child with the words, "My dad since I started being a teenager because I changed and I'm not the little girl he used to love anymore." These aren't just teenage angst posts. These are cries from a child living in a nightmare, reaching out through a screen because every adult in the physical world had abandoned her. She and the older kids, they held the key. And now, the very system that ignored them is suddenly in charge of interviewing them, shaping their testimony, deciding what version of the truth sees daylight. That should make your stomach turn. And look, I need you to stay with me here because the forensic interview process is where the real cover-up can happen. Dr. Daniel Bober, a forensic psychiatrist, explained how crucial the first interview is. He talked about psychosocial dwarfism, about how extreme deprivation literally stunts a child's growth, shuts down their ability to speak.
Well, when I think about the condition that these children were found in, what I think about is what's called psychosocial dwarfism or deprivation dwarfism. And this is a rare phenomenon that occurs when children are exposed to extreme emotional trauma, environmental deprivation, and chronic neglect. And essentially, what's happening is there's a chronic fight or flight response, which causes growth hormone to be suppressed in the pituitary gland and
Mm.
forces the child into a biological survival mode, stunting their growth and development. And this is what I'm seeing here when I look at some of these reports. And it's very rare indeed. And it shows a chronic pattern of abuse, neglect, and deprivation over years and what it can do to alter a child's physiology and development.
Some of those kids, even the older ones, were found nonverbal or barely able to communicate. So, investigators bring in speech pathologists and use play therapy, pictures, open-ended questions. They want to avoid leading the child shore. But who's in that room? Who's deciding what's a leading question and what's not?
Well, in this particular case, that might be even more important because we know that it seems like there's some developmental arrest there. There's some behavioral regression where some of the kids are nonverbal. Again, I didn't examine them, but that's what some of the reports I'm reading are saying. And so as a
Mm.
result, they may not be able to speak. And so a lot of times in these interviews, what we'll do is we'll use pictures that represent different actions or speak to them through play therapy, if you will, where they can act out some of these behaviors. But the most important thing we want to do is we want to make sure it's open ended so that we're not leading them to a conclusion. One of the things that we do in situations like this, with this particular level of deprivation and neglect, is we will bring in speech language pathologists to assess their communication skills because we want to make sure that they're able to express themselves and that they know what the difference is between a truth and a lie because kids this age are very open to suggestion and we don't want to give the defense any ammunition to challenge the interview or the veracity of the interview in the way that it's done.
Mm.
Children's Services visited the jailed adults almost immediately. Did they go in there to gather truth or to coordinate a narrative? The Attorney General's office is overseeing everything, funneling $1 million into therapeutic foster care money that will be tracked, they say, for transportation and immediate needs.
State legislators have sent $1 million to the Department of Children and Youth for that area of the state just for these kids, but that will likely be just a drop in the bucket.
This is a special fund that is being set up specifically for Vinton County. Vinton County does belong to a 3-county consortium, which is Hocking, Vinton, and Ross counties, but these resources are specifically for this emergent need. We know that many of them will be needing therapeutic foster care for quite some time to come. That is $150 a day to $250 a day on average. per child. So those costs alone would bankrupt the county.
But the real cost, the cost of exposing deep systemic failure, that's something no budget line item can cover. Honestly, when I first saw those TikTok videos, I had to stop. Something about a child reaching into the void and finding nothing, it just broke something inside me. And I think you felt it, too. It's that same sick feeling we all had watching the Turpin case, the Gabriel Fernandez horror, and now this. The pattern is undeniable. The child welfare apparatus, the police, the courts, they don't save kids until the smell of the house becomes a public indecency charge. Gary Jr. exposed himself to an outsider in late May. That's what finally triggered the search warrant. Not the 16 invisible children, not the social media cries. A misdemeanor indecency charge.
Christina Siders, Elizabeth Siders, and Gary Jr. all remain in jail. They're being held on a $300,000 bond each. Gary Jr. is scheduled to appear in court later this week for a pre-trial hearing on 4 misdemeanor counts of public indecency that he faces. Those charges relate to alleged incidents at the Siders' home in late May, in which law enforcement say Gary Jr. exposed himself to someone who was not a family member.
That's the only reason deputies walked into that house on Judith and found floors covered in feces and trash. The sheriff himself said the livestock outside were treated better than those kids.
So to your point, I think it's really interesting to think about the parents and the grandparents that were living in this home that allowed this to occur. I think the sheriff made the comment that the livestock were treated better than the kids. So what is the pathology, or what are these psychological factors that lead these caregivers to treat kids this way? Are we talking about, some kind of a shared delusion or some kind of intergenerational enmeshment where they believe that this type of treatment is accepted and is okay? But clearly the children were objectified in such a way as they almost existed as extensions of these caregivers, that they didn't see them as human beings, as their kids, but saw them as property, as objects to do as they wish.
Yet Gary Sr., the grandfather, got released from jail for a medical condition, while the children remain scattered across different counties in therapeutic foster homes, separated from each other, perhaps the only family they've ever known, no matter how twisted. The gag order and the bill of particulars request by the defense. These are tools designed to slow walk justice and exhaust the victims. Gary Jr. and Elizabeth pleaded not guilty to 16 counts of child endangering. The grandparents, Gary Sr. and Christina, same plea. But the older children, the ones who can spell out exactly what happened, who can detail the years of isolation, the filth, the abuse, they are now in a system that has every incentive to sanitize their words. Forensic interviewers say they want to get the most information in the first session because repeated interviews can overwrite memory.
A forensic interview setting, like how many times do you think they will interview them? Because sometimes, things come out bit by bit. Maybe, you're not going to just sit the child down unless they're very open to discussing this and everything comes out. It may happen in stages, right?
Well, that's true. But the other side of that is you want to try to get as much information as you can during the first interview, because the more you interview a child, the more you risk actually changing their memories of what happened. It's sort of like the brain is overwriting it, if you will. And so you want to try to get as much information as quickly as you can during that first interview and try to limit it, not only limit it in terms of distorting the information, but limiting it in terms of exposing the child to further trauma by having to relive or recall some of these events.
Mm-hmm.
So that one session, held behind independent oversight, will determine everything. And the reason for that, well, you'll see. The records will be sealed, the children shuffled through case plans, and the ugly, damning truth about how a whole community and its institutions failed will be boxed up as a family squabble, as extreme poverty, as anything but what it was, a human level deprivation allowed to fester for a decade. I need you to just sit with that for a second. This isn't some third world country. This is Ohio. Right now, in 2024, children live like that while neighbors, teachers, county workers, all silent. The parents had trash service but chose to let the garbage pile up inside. The grandparents, seen in old photos looking clean and normal, somehow devolved into monsters who saw their grandchildren as objects, as property. The forensic psychiatrist raised a terrifying question. Was this a shared delusion, an intergenerational evil that normalized the filth? Or did they know exactly what they were doing and simply didn't care, confident that nobody would ever come looking? That's the part that keeps me up at night. They knew they wouldn't get caught because the system is too broken to catch anyone until it's almost too late. But wait, because here's the sliver of hope they don't want you to have. The younger children, the 3 sets of twins, the ones whose brains still have neuroplasticity, they might recover.
Right. But the good news is, in the beginning of our conversation, I had spoken about psychosocial dwarfism or deprivation dwarfism. Once these kids, especially the younger kids, are put into a warm, loving, nurturing environment where are receiving positive feedback, adequate nutrition, food, clothing, shelter, healthy living conditions, most of them will recover significantly rather quickly. It may take several months, it may take a year or more, but just them being placed into these new nurturing conditions will likely cause a growth spurt and at least a trajectory or a direction towards normal development.
Put into a warm, nurturing environment with proper food and love, they could experience a growth spurt, a surge toward normal development. The older kids, though, the ones who can speak, the ones who hold the secrets, they may never fully heal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see, now that these kids are in therapeutic foster care, what will the future hold for them? I think the kids that are younger, where the brain has what we call more neural plasticity, they will tend to do better. But the older kids are really, I think, going to struggle. There are several periods in the brain where there are critical thresholds or windows of brain development. For example, language acquisition really closes around puberty. So these kids that are, 18 years old, if they're unable to speak or spell their name, there could be obviously some training and some rehabilitation. But the question is, will they ever be able to function normally?
Their windows of language acquisition, of trust, closed in that house of horrors. And every interview, every court hearing, every time they're made to relive the nightmare for a justice system that already betrayed them, it reopens wounds that may never scar over. So, here's the open question that should make you furious. What do you think those children are saying right now to investigators? Do you believe the truth, the whole raw truth, will ever see a courtroom? Or will the gag order and the sealed testimony bury it forever? Will the children who tried to expose this hell through their phones finally be heard? Or will they be silenced again? This time by the very people paid to protect them. I want to hear your gut feeling in the comments below. This case isn't closed. Not by a long shot, but the evidence, the real evidence, is in the minds of 16 traumatized kids. And if we don't demand transparency, those minds will be locked away just like the children were. You know it. I know it. And now, they know we're watching.